Greetings, everyone, and welcome to this discussion about the state of Ukraine's anti-corruption agencies and the recent political conflagration in the country with regards to new laws passed about those anti-corruption agencies. So, starting with the basics, on July 22nd, the Ukrainian parliament, the Verkhovna Rada, approved a new law subordinating Ukraine's two primary anti-corruption agencies, NABU, which investigates, and SEPO, which prosecutes, to the Federal Prosecutor's Office, which is subordinate to the President. Now, this comes following a number of other shakeups in Ukrainian politics of late, including a deputy prime minister being charged with corruption, and the switching of the Ukrainian prime minister. Now, this resulted in a lot of opposition, both at home and abroad. Particularly, there have been huge protests across Ukraine, not just in Kiev, against this law, the biggest since the war, and there have also been the threat of revoking certain grants and loans from the European Union, which were contingent on improvements in the field of corruption and governance. Now, the protests first occurred in the hope that Zelensky would not sign the bill, and intensified once he did, and now on the 31st, there will be a vote by the parliament on a new law, essentially undoing the old law, as a reaction to this inside and outside interior and exterior political pressure. Now, the reasoning behind this episode, the idea behind it, is to discuss a lot of nonsense that's been going around in Western circles with regards to this law, and generally with regards to discussion of Ukraine, and particularly the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Now, in the West, Zelensky has a very one-sided image, which is based primarily on his tremendously positive performance within the first year, and particularly the first month of the Russian invasion, where he did an undeniably incredible job. And there have been many cases since where he's done very well. He's been a very effective spokesman. His background as an actor and a comedian has been tremendously positive in making Ukraine's case to Western countries and securing the amount of military aid that has been given so far. With that said, many people here, I think, have an extremely unnuanced view of Zelensky, which is almost purely positive and often inaccurate. Now, some things that are worth knowing about him are that prior to the breakout of the war, he had an extremely low approval rating, and he was primarily elected as essentially a protest vote against the many failures of his predecessor, Petro Poroshenko, and he was not particularly popular, nor did he do a particularly good job being president prior to the Russian invasion. He's also had a number of major failures and political missteps over the course of his tenure during the war, which have gone largely ignored by most of the Western public and have not been particularly widely discussed. The two major ones are the firing of the former commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian military, that was Zaluzhny, and the complete failure to effectively push for mobilization and solve Ukraine's manpower problem, which has been a topic of major contention for, I think, essentially since late 2022, and was, by all accounts, a major bone of contention between Zelensky and Zaluzhny. And that is something that, holding a supermajority in parliament, and essentially with, between this and martial law, relatively unlimited political freedom, something he has completely failed to address. He's also overseen a tremendous centralization of power, to some extent necessitated by wartime conditions, but nonetheless, at times, questionable. A huge amount of Ukraine's political power has been centralized under Zelensky himself and his chief of staff, Andriy Yermak. Now, I'm not going to touch on Yermak too much. There is an excellent piece about him in the Financial Times that came out a couple of days ago, and another pretty good one that came out, I think, about a month and a half ago in Politico, both of which I would highly recommend. So we're not going to touch on him too much, but he was somewhat involved in this by the accounts that we have. It appears that this law was pushed forward by Zelensky, Yermak, and the chief of the prosecutor's office. And for anyone interested, that is Ruslan Kravchenko. They've pushed this forward with the full support of Zelensky's party in parliament, and they have been essentially overruled on it by huge levels of protest across Ukraine. Suffice to say that while some degree of centralization is both inevitable and necessary in wartime, it seems that in this case it may have gone at some points too far, and certainly that Yermak was the wrong person to centralize under. Now, what I'm actually looking to talk about is two things. One, what this actually says about the state of Ukraine as a political entity, and two, how we should react to this in the West and look at it, and how it is healthy to interpret it. Let's start by making three core points. One, this is both a sign of great unhealthiness in Ukraine's government and a very healthy sign for Ukraine as a whole, and the way that these protests have unfolded, the scale of them, their nonviolence, and their success is a tremendously positive sign for Ukrainian civil society and Ukrainian political development during and after the war, and that is something that is absolutely worth celebrating. Two, Zelensky is not going to be leaving office over this. He is not going to be forced out. That's an idea that's been somewhat popular on the Western internet that frankly baffles me and has absolutely no basis in fact. It does probably spell doom for his rumored ambitions to hold early elections, or I suppose delayed elections, but premature, let us say, premature elections this summer in the wake of his increased popularity following clashes with Donald Trump. Those plans are almost certainly dead. I'm not citing journalism or insider sources here, but I think we can safely say that that's not going to happen anymore. And both of these things are positive. One, that Zelensky is not going anywhere. While this is a huge mistake that he bears almost sole responsibility for, changing presidents during wartime, even if it were possible to hold a proper election, which it isn't, is not necessarily a great idea, especially when we would have to reopen a lot of politics that have been very effectively closed over the course of the war and resume kind of interior political competition to a great extent. And the ability to shut that down and to unify around Zelensky and around the war with Russia is one of the reasons that Ukraine has been able to survive this war thus far. So it is very good that Zelensky is going to be sticking around, although there was never any serious danger of him being pushed out. And it's also very good that this election is being avoided because it would have been catastrophic and it would have been, in my opinion, a misstep on a scale that far exceeds the firing of Zaluzhny or this anti-corruption issue. It would have been an absolute catastrophe for Ukraine. Now, the third point that I want to make will hopefully be obvious, but there has been a large number of people in the West who have failed to regard this. So, Ukraine is a political country, like all countries, with a politicized population to varying degrees, run by politicians. Ukraine has domestic politics. Ukraine's president will make missteps and bad decisions, both out of incompetence and out of bad intent, like any president will. Now, despite the war, Ukraine continues to have its own politics, political competitions, political conflicts, and destabilizations, like any country does. And the fact that the country has been able to pull together so well during wartime does not mean that there are no politics there. And as a result, it is a tremendous mistake to assume that Zelensky is a singular representative of the will of the Ukrainian people, or that whatever he does is necessarily good, right, or for a good reason. Now, we've seen with this case that he has claimed that the reason for the bill and that he signed it was because these anti-corruption agencies were supposedly infiltrated by pro-Russian elements. Now, not to put too fine a point on it, from the outside at least, this appears to be absolute nonsense. It looks like, and Ukrainians evidently en masse feel the same way given these protests, it looks like Zelensky has pushed for the undermining of these anti-corruption agencies specifically to prevent and quash investigations into people in his inner circle, particularly, it seems, people associated with Yermak. And apologies, I know I said that I wasn't going to touch on this, but Yermak has been an extremely negative figure over the course of this war in a lot of ways. He's been an extremely ineffective diplomat who is extremely unpopular abroad. There's a great article I think I mentioned earlier in Politico quoting one US official who described him as a bipartisan irritator. And he's also pushed often in a very negative direction domestically, particularly his attempts to unseat Ukraine's tremendously popular and tremendously effective military intelligence chief, Kirilo Budanov. This whole process has been a tremendous mistake, which appears has had the strong support of Zelensky and his parliamentary grouping, but it doesn't seem to be something that came from the parliament. It seems to be something that came from Zelensky and his administration. With that said, there's no credence to the idea that this is going to result in his loss of the presidency, or that the tremendously negative reaction to this in the international press is a sign of some great Western turn against Ukraine. That is also, again, nonsense. This is simply a tremendously negative political choice, which deserves all of the condemnation that it has received. Now, this affair has been, one, a tremendous condemnation of the state of Ukrainian politics at the highest levels, and particularly of the presidential administration, but two, it's been an incredibly positive hour for Ukrainian civil society, which has proven that it still has some of the fire that was demonstrated in 2014 and is still capable of forcing positive change in society. This is an incredibly optimistic sign for the development of Ukrainian politics after the war, but I think, unfortunately, it's a fairly pessimistic one for the development of Ukrainian political affairs over the course of the war and the rest of Zelensky's tenure. As for the outcome, things have turned out very well. Nonetheless, there will be lasting political damage as a result of this. Trust in Zelensky and in the political administration that he oversees will decline as a result of this, even though it has been reversed, and it will weaken support for him in particularly Europe. But it has not been the absolute catastrophe that it could have been, and if this bill had remained in place, it would have been disastrous, especially given the importance of anti-corruption operations to the war effort and the success of the Ukrainian military, because corruption is still a major issue which reduces the effectiveness of the Ukrainian military, and the more it is reduced, the better it will perform on the battlefield. I'd also like to note that Ukraine is not a particularly hard country to follow, and it is very much worth following Ukraine's politics at this time. And you can find good coverage of particularly this incident, but generally ongoing goings-on in Ukrainian politics in a lot of good places, particularly with regards to this incident. There's been some excellent reporting on it in The Economist and the Financial Times with regards to Western journalism, and some good stuff in the Washington Post as well as domestic Ukrainian journalism in places like Ukrainska Pravda and Western-facing Ukrainian propaganda outlets like the Kyiv Independent. There are a lot of good places that you can follow stuff like this, and it is worth looking into because everybody at this point seems to have an opinion on Ukraine, and it is good when those opinions are based in reality. Now, I'd highly recommend looking at the work of some of the outlets that I've mentioned, and because it's so well covered there, I'm not going to go into any particular depth about the actual law and what its consequences would have been or the corruption situation in Ukraine. I particularly would really recommend this article about Yermak in the Financial Times, which is just excellent. Going on from that, I would like to emphasize before I wrap up that I am by no means an expert on Ukraine, but there has been a sufficient amount of nonsense floating around in the popular sphere in the West that is easily dispelled by following Ukraine even a little bit, that I thought it was worth addressing given the volume of nonsense. And one final note before we wrap up, there's also an absolutely excellent profile that The Economist has just run on Vladimir Medinsky, Putin's former culture minister who has now been put in charge of leading these negotiations with Ukraine in Istanbul. I would highly recommend that. And one last bit of housekeeping. I've got a couple of things that are in the pipeline for this podcast coming up. These include a comprehensive and in-depth piece on the Russian prison system, which will hopefully be at some point within the next week or two. And following that, I'm looking at another seriously in-depth piece about how Russia changed over the first year of the war, so keep an eye out for those. And with all that out of the way, thank you very much for listening.